The scripture reading. Thank you, Rochelle.
Today's scripture reading is from Luke chapter 17, verse 11 to verse 19. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourself to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were you not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." The word of the Lord.
All right, well, hey, good morning, everyone. Good to see you today. My name is Walt. I'm one of the pastors here. So glad that we could gather together. For the past couple of weeks, we've been in this season of Lent, which is a 40-day period leading up to the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is what we celebrate on Easter Sunday. And on Sundays here, we've been opening up the Gospel of Luke, which is one of the 4 biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. And we've been looking at scenes that Jesus is having on the road to Jerusalem, which is where he will eventually be crucified and killed. And this portion of the Bible is basically like a greatest hits album of memorable scenes and noteworthy moments. The parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus' encounter with the tax collector Zacchaeus, and many more. And each of these scenes is layered with incredible insight and profound meaning, which is why followers of Jesus have been talking about these stories for 2,000 years. And today's passage is no different. But it might not seem that way at first. At first glance, today's story seems pretty straightforward. There are 10 men suffering with leprosy. They ask Jesus to heal them, as Jesus has done for countless others, and he does. But despite the fact that all 10 were healed, only one comes back to thank Jesus, and he is commended for his faith. And if we are reading through Luke's gospel, we might be inclined to breeze over this passage because, hey, I think I got it. The lesson seems pretty simple, right? Like, it's important to say thank you, and we keep rolling on. But that's certainly how I thought about the story for a long time. However, as we've seen time and again, when we come to the scriptures, there's often so much more happening below the surface that we are going to miss if we don't slow down to really take in what's going on. And this story is no exception. But before we jump into the text, I want to tell you about one of my favorite things, CrossFit. I love CrossFit. Now, honestly, I try not to talk about it a lot because I know I'm a walking cliche. I'm a pastor who does CrossFit, and I know the reputation that CrossFitters have. I've seen the memes, okay? So I try not to be all chatty about it because I don't want to be one of those guys. But I've been doing CrossFit for well over a decade. I love it. I try to get in the gym just about every day that I can. I've been coaching CrossFit for about 6 years. It's a huge part of our life. And I view the secret sauce in CrossFit isn't the workouts, it's really the community, it's the people, right? The shared suffering that we are experiencing week in and week out. There are so many days I will look at the workout and I'll say, I do not want to go in. That's really going to hurt. But I kind of roll myself out of bed. I get in there. I say hey to all my friends. 3, 2, 1, go. We do the workout, and then we're all lying on the floor, sweating, gasping for air, but we're giving each other high fives. You're like, whew, that was awesome. Let's do it again tomorrow. I'll see you here, right? It was something that we did together. And our gym is a motley crew of people. We have a high school principal, we have high school students, we have finance bros, we have firemen, we have guys who grew up in the Rockaways, we have guys who grew up in Romania, right? It's a lot of people who shouldn't really be in the same room together, but we have this unified experience of going through something hard together. There's something about going through something difficult together that changes the fabric of our relationships. In many instances, we've chosen shared suffering. Sports teams that are forged in the fires of competition and training. med students who are slogging through their residency together, right? How no one understands what new moms are going through except for other moms. We see this in communities who serve together, just like right here at Hope. Last Sunday after church, we had a lunch to celebrate all of our Sunday teams who have been gearing up for today, going into 3 services, and we just got to celebrate and appreciate one another and give thanks. Because we were doing something hard, but we were doing it together, and it felt really worthwhile. It felt really meaningful, and it changed how we relate to one another. Have you ever had an experience of shared suffering quite like that? But we also know a lot of shared suffering is not chosen. Making connections on the cancer ward or the hospital wing because now you're around some people who really know what you're going through. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, support groups for people whose family members are going through addiction. Being trauma bonded through things like the pandemic or 9/11 or other catastrophes that you've endured with people whom you might not have otherwise met. You know, Rihanna sang about finding love in a hopeless place. Maybe you didn't find love, but perhaps you found companionship with somebody when you were in a dark time, and they happened to be in that same darkness too. This is what's happening for the 10 lepers in our story today. As you may know, leprosy was a terrible skin disease that frequently proved fatal. The real problem with leprosy was that it affected your nervous system. It caused your nerves to deteriorate and decay, which would lead to a lot of problematic spots on your face and your extremities, your fingers, your toes, and they'd lose feeling, and this would lead to deformities, but really what would happen is you would injure your hand or your foot, but you wouldn't really know because you couldn't feel anything. And then that wound would get infected and gangrene and so on and so on. It was not a good situation. And it could also be highly contagious. So if you got this awful disease, like things were about to get a lot worse for you because you weren't just getting this terrible sickness, you were about to get kicked out of your very own community. So the only people who hung out with lepers were other lepers. Those were your options. And that's what was happening with this crew. Their suffering was bringing them together when nothing else would have done the same. But there's even more to it than that. The scene takes place along the border between Judea and Samaria. Pastor Drew shared a little bit about the dynamics that between these two people groups when he preached about the parable of the Good Samaritan a couple weeks ago. But the quick recap is that these people did not like each other. There was generations of conflict and even violence, and so this border was a hard line. You did not cross it. Even Jews who were traveling from the northern part of Judea to the southern part where Jerusalem is, like Jesus was, would take the long way around to avoid having to cross into this nation. You did not cross it. But what's interesting is that despite these racial tensions, this group of lepers is mixed. There's a Samaritan in their squad, which is kind of wild because under normal circumstances, this would have never happened. But leprosy has a way of changing things. When you've been hit with a physical and social death sentence, cultural dividing lines, even ones that are deeply entrenched, they don't seem to matter as much. When your life is falling apart, when your body is falling apart, then you look at other people differently. And you don't play the same games that you used to play. Because it would be a little weird if a leper was walking around going, oh, where'd you go to school? What part of town do you live in? How many followers do you have on social media? I'd be like, bro, you have bigger things to be worrying about, right? Like, you're a dead man walking. You probably should not be caught up in all of this posturing, all of these social hierarchy dynamics. So these men who should have been separated on account of their ethnicity were actually brought together by their sickness. But all that changed because Jesus came into their world. Jesus was walking towards Jerusalem, and he was continuing to teach people about the kingdom of God, but also show them about the kingdom of God through his miracles and through his provision. And he was telling them, like, this is what this kingdom is all about. Generosity, freedom, reconciliation, healing, and hope. And so these 10 men had heard about who Jesus was and what he was up to, and they managed to catch him before he went into a village, which was probably where many of them had grown up, but were now forbidden to enter. And they caught him just as he was entering, and they pleaded with him, "Master Jesus, have pity on us." And when Jesus saw them, he said, "Go show yourself to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed of this otherwise incurable disease. Amazing, amazing stuff. The kind of miracle we have seen Jesus do time and again, because this is what life with Jesus is all about: healing and hope, even in the midst of the most impossible circumstances. And Jesus instructs them to see the priest because there were certain protocols that they needed to go through in order to prove their healing, right? This wasn't something you would just take their word for, like, I'm healed, I promise. Like, no, like, trust but verify. And Jesus wanted to make sure they could be reintegrated back into the community, because that's part of the healing that Jesus was concerned about too. They had been tied together by their sickness, but now they could be bound together by their healing, by their new life. They were once dead, but now they're alive. What an incredible thing. This is the kind of thing that you probably tell everybody about for the rest of your life. I could imagine them having like little reunions for the group of 10 of them and their families. So to keep telling the story, celebrating the story, because it changed everything. But that's not what happened. Luke tells us one of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Luke is continuing to highlight for us how the people who were supposedly on like the religious inside, the Judeans, how they continued to miss what God was doing through Jesus. And that those who were supposedly on the outside, tax collectors, women, lepers, Samaritans, they were the ones who were actually getting what was going on. They understood who Jesus was, and they kept stepping towards him in faith. And Jesus rightly asks, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? It's a great question. Where are these other guys? Why did they not come back and thank Jesus along with the Samaritan? Were they just really ungrateful? Maybe. I think that was certainly a part of it. But I think there's something more going on here. My strong sense is that now that they were healed, well, they just weren't hanging out with Samaritans anymore. Now that they were healed, they were content to slide back into those old social dynamics, happy to retake their place on the social ladder. Leper was like the bottom rung. Jewish male got you bumped up pretty high. Samaritan, down low again. Maybe you're thinking like, hey, Walt, I don't know. That's a bit of a strange take. Like the text doesn't really say that. And that's fair, right? It's not explicitly stated in the text. But I also know that the force and strength of these social divisions might be hard for us to grasp because we're not familiar with that ancient reality. But what if this story were told in a context that we might feel a little bit closer to or a little bit more familiar with, right? What if this happened in the Jim Crow South? And it was a story of 9 white dudes and a black man. Or modern day New York City, and it involved 9 hedge fund guys and a kid from the projects. We probably start to connect those dots a little bit. These guys could have been bonded together by their healing. But instead they reverted back to their former ways of living. It's important to note that there are some really significant word choices happening in our story. Our English translations don't really capture all the nuance of what's happening here. So words like cleansed, heal, and made well sound mostly the same to our ears. But the original Greek makes some meaningful distinctions. We're told that after the lepers encounter Jesus and go through the ritual cleansing, that they are healed. The Greek word for healing is iomai, which is exactly what we think of, a word for physical healing. But when the Samaritan goes back to Jesus, throws himself at Jesus' feet, thanks him for what he has done, Jesus tells him that he has been made well. And Jesus isn't just reiterating what had already happened. He's speaking to something new that's happening right here, right now. And the word that Jesus uses to describe made well, which we translate as made well, is sozo. Sozo is frequently translated as to save or to make whole. Unlike the other 9, this man is experiencing something much deeper than physical healing. He is being made whole physically, relationally, spiritually. Jesus gave him a taste of this kingdom. He iomai'd him, but ultimately he wanted him to have a relationship with the king, to sozo him. The other 9 had been healed. They'd been iomai'd, but they were still sick. Maybe they didn't have a bodily disease anymore, but there was still a disease of their hearts and their souls that needed to be healed. They needed to be made whole. And Jesus' vision for their life was much more than simply physical healing. Jesus wanted them to be a part of this new kingdom that he was bringing on earth, where they would be reconciled to God and reconciled to one another. And gratitude was going to be the glue that held these relationships together. You know, I think that whenever we have a need, whenever we cry out to God, because it's something drastic, something desperate, just like the lepers were doing, which is a good response, many of us will ask God to heal or provide. But I think that this story makes us ask an interesting question. Was getting their prayer answered really the best thing for these lepers? You know, they were desperate for Jesus when they were sick. But once they got what they wanted, well, they couldn't really be bothered to say thank you. They put distance between themselves and the Samaritan. This healing didn't actually bring them into a new way of living. It just kind of put them back into their old ways. You know, how many of us have also prayed desperate prayers for God to heal, to provide, to restore, to show up? Maybe we haven't gotten those prayers answered the way we would want it. Maybe we feel a little miffed, like God is holding out or ignoring us. Maybe we find ourselves like having like a little beef with God because we've been struggling. We've been trying our hardest to be good and faithful, but instead of God rewarding us the way we've asked, we continue to suffer. That's real. And I think that ultimately we don't know why God answers prayers the way we pray them, or why he doesn't. You know, in many ways, prayer is a mystery. It's a mystery. Sometimes we get what we're asking for. Sometimes we don't. I think that we can trust in whatever is happening. God is near and close, and loves us, will never let us go. But if we're not getting what we are asking for, then I think this story invites us to consider maybe there's a possibility that God not giving us what we want might actually be God's mercy to us, God's grace to us. That God knows for one reason or another that this is not actually the most important thing that we need right now. God wants to do something different in our lives, and that if we actually get what it is that we think we need or that we want, it might actually set us back in our relationship with God, not strengthen it. Because let's be honest, how many of us have had a prayer answer the way we wanted? And there was this initial rush of gratitude, right? We got that job, we passed that test, we experienced some kind of healing or provision. Wow. But then as time went on, our gratitude subsided. our spiritual lives tapered off a little bit. Our desire for God, our felt need for God waned. We got caught up in the daily grind, swept up in cultural currents. And at the end of the day, it seemed like we actually wanted the gift more than the giver. Jesus asked the Samaritan, where are the rest? Where are the other 10? Where are the rest of the gratitude that he is owed? Have you ever given someone a gift that you put a lot of time and energy into thinking about, that you prepared especially for them? Or you gave them something really generous, extravagant even, and you were super excited to give it to them, and the big moment came, and he gave it to them, and their response was kind of mid, kind of flat, or they didn't respond at all. I remember a time that Jen and I gave a friend a pretty generous gift. We knew that it would be a big help to his family, and it was a sacrifice on our end. But when the moment came and we presented the gift, we were met with oh, thanks. And I felt like I just passed him the ketchup or something. I was like, this gratitude does not reflect the level of the gift here. And I was kind of wondering, hey, where's the rest? Where's the rest of the acknowledgement? Where's the rest of the gratitude? Ultimately, what I'd hoped for was that through this gift, that our families could become closer, for the relationship to grow stronger, but it didn't really seem to move the needle all that much. And I found myself asking the question that Jesus was asking the Samaritan, where's the rest? The rest of the appreciation, the rest of the gratitude. And of course, this is a question that Jesus has for many of us as well. Where's the rest? When we take an honest look in the mirror, have our lives been a life of gratitude? Especially for those of us who have been walking with Jesus, who have seen Jesus show up in big ways. Has our life been a life of gratitude that has brought us closer to the King? Or have we loved the gifts more than the giver? Have we appreciated what God did? Thank you. But then just kind of got back to our old habits, old ways of living. Now, some of us might be tempted to hear this and think yeesh, is Jesus some kind of self-centered, manipulative guy? He just wants to guilt people into saying thank you all the time, who's constantly holding what he's done over our heads like some kind of controlling parent. Don't you know how much I've done for you? Don't you know how grateful you should be? But here's what we need to remember. Gratitude is not a demand of devotion. Gratitude sets us free. It sets us free. The 9 lepers, they were healed, but they were still sick. And the Samaritan's gratitude drew him closer to Jesus, and it was through that encounter that he was made whole. Gratitude is the way that we can become whole people in Jesus. The season of Lent is a time of self-examination and considering what sins we may be trapped in that we need to turn from. And some streams of Christianity have highlighted 7 sins, sometimes called the 7 deadly sins, that there can be the root sins that everything else is traced back to. Pride, greed, sloth, envy, gluttony, lust, and wrath. These sins fundamentally set us against other people. Comparison, control, violence, exploitation, abuse, selfishness, they all stem from these sins. They all trap us in these old ways of living. But do you know what can be the antidote to all of these? Gratitude. Gratitude. Gratitude is the glue that repairs our relationship with God and one another. These deadly sins will erode our relationships with Jesus or with our neighbors. But do you know what will keep you from the trap of envy and greed? Gratitude for what God has given you. Do you know what will keep you from the trap of lust and gluttony? Gratitude. That God has provided and that God says that you are enough, just as you are. Do you know what will keep you from wrath? Gratitude for the grace and mercy that God gives you every moment of every day. I shared a little how I felt kind of miffed that my friend didn't offer the thanks I felt like I deserved. But when I continued to process it, you know what I saw? My own pride. Right from that list. My own sense of entitlement, my own hypocrisy. Because there have been too many times in my own life where I have not offered the gratitude that was appropriate or sufficient for what my neighbors have done and for what Jesus has done in my life. And as Jesus highlighted that, I felt myself being offered another chance to lay down my pride, to lay down my entitlement, and to take hold of gratitude instead. To draw closer to God, to feel closer to my friend. Because, church, Jesus does not want to simply IOMI us. Jesus wants to sozo us, to save us, to make us whole people, to restore our relationship with God and our relationship with others, to pull us out of those old systems, those old habits, those old social ladders, those old sins, and pull him into a loving relationship with God's self that is going to fundamentally change who we are, how we relate to God, how we relate to one another. A love that is going to change us all the way down, body, mind, soul, relationships, and beyond. True whole life. How does God do this? Jesus lived a life of gratitude, a life of continual thanks and delight and contentment, and we see this culminate at the end of his life. Eventually, he does reach the end of this road to Jerusalem, and during the final night there, he was at a dinner table with his friends who just a few hours from that moment would betray him and abandon him. And he's sitting at this meal, and we're told that he took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Jesus gave thanks that it would be his body given for us, broken for us, crucified for us. Because he knew it was the only way for those whom he loved, us, to be made whole. This is why he went to the cross, for the joy set before him. His body given so that we could be made new. Right? Any kind of IOMI healing or provision that we receive in this life is a taste. But the real thing that Jesus accomplished through his death was our sozo healing. To save us, to make us whole. This is not a gift that we can earn. It's not a gift that we can achieve. There's nothing that we can do to manufacture receiving it on our own terms. It is simply a gift that we are to receive with gratitude. With gratitude. And just as the Samaritan man threw himself at the feet of Jesus, as we receive this gift of love and grace, we simply give ourselves back to God. To say, I want to have new, whole, full life in your kingdom. To follow you as the King. And it changes how we relate to our world. We don't get caught up in these social ladders that the world plays. We're not trying to figure out where we are, where other people are. Why? Because at the end of the day, we are all like the lepers. We are all sick, sinful, in need of healing. We all have this experience of shared suffering. And yet we also share in the suffering of Jesus. So that through his suffering, we would be made whole. So now we share in this new life we have together as people in God's kingdom. So how might renewed gratitude bring about fuller healing in your life? There are 2 weeks until Easter. Perhaps a practice that you could incorporate every day between now and then would simply be to keep a gratitude journal. To every day, take a couple of minutes and just write down what it is that you are grateful for. Bonus points if you write different things each day. I promise you will not run out of things to say, of ways to be grateful, to reshape your heart away from scarcity and competition and division and bring it to a place of thanksgiving. And perhaps as you're kind of going about your day and you realize, there's some pride bubbling up, there's some greed bubbling up, there's some lust bubbling up, that as you become aware of what's happening inside of you, each of those moments becomes an occasion to say, I want to stop right there. And I want to turn my heart towards gratitude and thanks for the love of grace in God, for the people in my life. And I want to walk in this world in a different kind of way, a way that is marked by gratitude, not competition, division, one-upmanship, but a life of humble thanks to the gifts that our King has given us. These might not feel like massive steps. But remember, all the Samaritan did was come to Jesus and say, thank you. And that was enough to make him whole, to sozo him. Jesus wants to make you whole today, to sozo you today. Maybe as a continuation of the work that he has been doing in you, maybe for the very first time, an opportunity to receive the gift of his love and his grace today and to be made whole, a new person in his new kingdom. I want to invite our worship team up.